In June 1941, Adolf Hitler made a decision that baffled both the enemy and his own officers, and which potentially changed the course of the war forever. He ordered his generals to invade the Soviet Union, one of Germany's most valuable allies since 1939. This not only opened a new and unnecessary battlefront, but presented the German armies with several challenges. The unrelenting cold, the immense manpower of the Red Army, and the bravery of the Soviet people who took arms immediately against the invaders were some of the factors that hampered the German invasion of Russia, and that would ultimately be their downfall. What made Hitler so sure that he would be victorious in Russia? What was it like to fight in the cold Siberian winter? And what brutal fates found the German soldiers deep into enemy territory? One thing is clear. The Eastern Front was the setting of some of the bloodiest and cruelest battles of World War II. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's arrogance or military genius. 2 years into World War II, the mighty armies of Adolf Hitler seemed unstoppable. Germany was now controlling Poland, Denmark, Norway, France, Yugoslavia, and parts of northern Africa. Italy had joined the Axis in 1940, and the relentless bombing of the Luftwaffe terrorized the whole British population. Furthermore, on August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a pact of non-aggression that became known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The arrangement included a prohibition of attacking each other for 10 years. Less than 2 years later, Hitler was ready to break the pact and send his troops into one of the most senseless and brutal killings of World War II. The successful airborne invasion of Crete convinced the Germans that they could keep expanding eastward, as their western borders were protected by the Allied states of Spain, Portugal, and Italy, and the British were unable to launch any successful counter-offensive at that moment. This was before the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the United States were following the European events with interest but with no desire or need to participate. Operation Barbarossa was launched early on 22 June 1941, just a few weeks after the invasion of Crete, and was the largest clash of arms the world had ever seen. Germany had amassed more than 3 million men, a colossal number that they thought would be enough to subjugate the Soviet population and give Hitler control over most of Europe and a great deal of Asia. It was an ambitious plan, which according to documents recovered after the war was something Hitler was planning since its beginning. However, it had been decided that the invasion of Russia would only take place after France and Britain had been defeated, and while the Germans had defeated France completely in only 6 weeks, the British were still fighting back. Historians have debated extensively over the past decades the reasons that Germany had for launching such a senseless attack at that precise moment. After all, we now know that they had hugely underestimated the challenges of the Eastern Front. It is calculated that, of the 70 to 85 million deaths that happened because of World War II, 40 million occurred on the Eastern Front. But of course, in the spring of 1941, nobody could have predicted such a death toll. In fact, Hitler had 2 very important and convincing reasons to hurry the attack on his former allies. The first reason was momentum. Germany seemed unstoppable, and this, paired with the flawless propaganda machine directed by Joseph Goebbels, had an intoxicating effect on the morale of the troops. Most German soldiers believed the end of the war was near, and that they would return to their hometowns victorious, to the acclaim of their women and the rest of the population. Germany was winning battle after battle, and capturing key strategic positions such as Crete on the Mediterranean Sea and Denmark on the Northern Sea. On the other hand, the Red Army had suffered a series of defeats that rendered it both useless as an ally and vulnerable to an attack directed to its heart. Indeed, the Soviet army had just lost almost 400,000 men in Finland, over 105 long days between 1939 and 1940 in what became known as the Winter War. The Finns held off Soviets for far longer than it was first expected, and while ultimately they were overrun by the colossal manpower of the Red Army, it was a huge moral victory for Finland. After this pitiful campaign, Germany decided that the Soviet Union was at their weakest. Secondly, Hitler, who was a history buff and had fought World War I, was well aware of the harsh conditions during winter in Russia. If he moved fast, like he did in France, he calculated that Leningrad and Stalingrad would fall in the first weeks of the campaign and that Stalin would be forced to sign a peace treaty before the summer ended. The recent successful campaigns in the Balkan Peninsula and Scandinavia meant that an important portion of Germany's manpower, weapons and vehicles were now relatively close to the Soviet border, helping the logistics of Operation Barbarossa. All of this convinced Hitler that it was time to act, otherwise he would have to wait a full year, and it might be too late. The trouble was, the Soviet Union was more than 10 times the size of France and the Low Countries, and Germany had a force that was only slightly larger than that of the previous year when Hitler attacked in the west. What's more, did not have substantial panzer forces, the German elite units that had been the spearhead of victory in France. As in France, most German troops were to advance into Russia on foot and by horse. The difference was that the attack front for Operation Barbarossa was around 1,200 miles long. The objective of Operation Barbarossa was no less than the complete annihilation of the Red Army. This was a tall order, even for an army full of confidence and flushed with victory. The invasion was also to be conducted with brutal violence. According to Adolf Hitler, the Eastern Campaign was more than a mere contest of arms. It was a struggle between two worldviews. The General Staff of the Wehrmacht, the German armed services, had already put together a plan to take the farmlands of the Ukraine. This would mean starving between 20 and 30 million Soviet citizens, but Nazi Germany viewed it as a war of survival, so this was considered regrettably acceptable. The Soviet leadership and intelligentsia were also to be exterminated. Hitler told his generals they had 3 months to win this victory, after which they would then turn back west and deal with Britain once and for all. But things on the Eastern Front were far from being so straightforward. Scorched earth policy, Germany's painful advance into enemy territory. Overwhelming force along what was initially a 500-mile front gouged out huge chunks of Soviet territory in the first fortnight of battle as the German armies swept forward, while above the Luftwaffe hammered the Red Army's air forces. The Baltic states were swiftly overrun in the north, while in the center much of former Poland was swept aside. Once again, the German armies seemed unstoppable. Stalin was taken by surprise and did not react at first, but after assessing the situation carefully, he began to plan the resistance. On 30th June, he formed a war cabinet, the People's Commissariat of Defense, and the next day spoke to the people, appealing to their patriotism. At the same time, the security services were united under the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs and ordered to clamp down even harder on defeatism and deserters, and to ensure there was no slackening of the struggle for survival. On the 19th of July, Hitler ordered that Leningrad in the north and the Ukraine in the south were the priorities, and that his only 2 panzer groups currently pushing towards Moscow should be sent to help with these drives once Smolensk, 360 miles southwest of the capital, had been crushed. The Soviet capital would be left to the Luftwaffe, even though he was warned by its leader, Hermann Göring, that there were not enough bombers available to do the job. Meanwhile, Stalin ordered that a further 5 million men were called up to the Red Army. The Soviets had been horrifically beaten in the opening stages of Barbarossa, but they had not been completely defeated. The German advance was increasingly dependent on the railway network, but the Soviet Union operated on a different gauge. This meant that the Germans could not use the existing railways and needed to painstakingly change the tracks as they moved east. Also, Stalin had ordered a scorched earth policy, as the Red Army fell back deep into Soviet territory. All factories, bridges, farmland, and infrastructure were to be destroyed so the Germans could not use it. On 24th June, Stalin had also ordered the establishment of a council for evacuation. Under its command, the vast bulk of the USSR's industry was to be moved to the Urals, 600 miles east of Moscow. By the beginning of August, this was already well underway, and in the end proved incredibly effective. As the German army advanced, it found itself without roads, infrastructure, or supplies that could be seized. To carry out the Scorched Earth order by Stalin and the Council for Evacuation, destruction battalions were formed in frontline areas, having the authority to summarily execute any suspicious person. The destruction battalions burned down villages, schools, and public buildings. As a part of this policy, the Red Army and the Soviet secret police massacred thousands of anti-Soviet prisoners. The secret police was in charge of the prisoners of war. They were responsible for bringing them from the front line, where they were captured, to the prisoner of war camps in inland Russia. But as most transports were used for the war effort, Stalin's secret police decided to save resources by making the prisoners march through the cold Russian steppes. In Ukraine and western Belarusia, 60,000 people were forced to evacuate on foot. The official Soviet count had more than 9,800 reportedly executed in prisons, 1,443 executed in the process of evacuation, 59 killed for attempting to escape, 23 killed by German bombs, and 1,057 deaths from other causes. Not all of these prisoners were German. Many were political prisoners that had been captured before the war even began. In total, the Soviet Union killed almost 1 million captured Nazis. Out of the 90,000 captured in the Battle of Stalingrad, the bloodiest of the whole campaign, only 5,000 Germans were lucky enough to be sent back to their country alive. The key to understanding this bloodbath lies in the fact that Soviet authorities did not punish, and sometimes actually encouraged, brutality against the German prisoners. They were not committing war crimes nor violating international treaties, but barely doing a service to the motherland by erasing the fascist pigs from the land. With the advancement of the war, the political administration of the Red Army tried to limit the practice of killing prisoners, as they could be valuable sources of intelligence that could be used against the enemy. But their efforts were fruitless. In battle, Red Army men and commanders did not bother capturing soldiers and officers. There are known cases of captives that were strangled and stabbed to death with knives of bayonets. Seeing that they could not stop their soldiers from murdering captured Germans, the Red Army chose to take an administrative approach, asking officers to at least make an inventory of the weapons and personal belongings taken from the dead Nazis. The Siege of Leningrad, a harrowing display of cruelty. The Black Sea port of Kiev in the south was captured by the Germans on the 19th of August. It was another massive victory, but it would be the last. Hitler now agreed that the main effort should be focused on Moscow, but this involved an enormous redeployment of forces, which took time. Hitler's expectations of a quick victory were destroyed. The battle for Moscow, codenamed Operation Typhoon, was launched on September 30th, 3.5 months after the invasion had begun, and by this time it had begun to rain. The rain soon turned the rough roads to mud. Vehicles increasingly broke down or became stuck. Fuel could no longer be supplied in the quantities required. Casualties were mounting and manpower was running short. Replacements of men, machines, and spare parts could not be found or delivered in the numbers needed. What made the Wehrmacht special was the speed with which it operated, but when it slowed down, it was not very effective. Although the German advance was slowing, by October they were just 120 miles from the capital. Civilians were ordered to help build an extra defense line, while General Georgy Zhukov was brought in to defend the city with massive reinforcements of troops. At the same time, more industry and even state archives were sent east to the Urals. The Germans continued to close on the city, but rain had now given way to snow and a dramatic drop in temperatures for which they were simply not equipped. Only in the Luftwaffe had anyone thought ahead and ordered winter clothing. The army had none at all. Meanwhile, to the north, the main target of the German advance was Leningrad, with the help of Finnish troops. The Germans planned to pound Leningrad into the dust with artillery and bombing. The starving civilian population would be deported east, the defending troops destroyed, and then the city would be leveled with demolition charges. There was to be no mercy. The Germans attacked Leningrad in August 1941. In the following 3 black months of 1941, 400,000 residents of the city worked to build the city's fortifications as fighting continued, while 160,000 others joined the ranks of the Red Army. Worker battalions and even schoolboy units were formed all over the city, who joined in digging trenches as they prepared to defend the city. On the 7th of September, the German 20th Motorized Division seized the town of Schlisselburg, cutting off all land routes to Leningrad. The Germans severed the railroads to Moscow and captured the railroad to Murmansk with Finnish assistance to inaugurate the start of a siege that would last for over 2 years. The siege became one of the longest and most destructive sieges in history, and it was possibly the costliest siege in history due to the number of casualties which were suffered throughout its duration. An estimated 1.5 million people died as a result of the siege, in what effectively was a genocide perpetrated by the German army. When Hitler was sure that no roads to and from the city of Leningrad remained open, he ordered the final destruction of Leningrad with no prisoners taken, and on 9th September, Army Group North began the final push. Within 10 days, it had advanced within 11 kilometers or 7 miles of the city. However, the push over the last kilometers was very slow, and casualties mounted. Hitler, now out of patience, ordered that Leningrad should not be stormed, but rather starved into submission. Army Group Center remained static and was subjected to numerous Soviet counterattacks, in particular the Yelnya offensive, in which the Germans suffered their first major tactical defeat since their invasion began. This Red Army victory also provided an important boost to Soviet morale. These attacks prompted Hitler to concentrate his attention back to Army Group Center and its drive on Moscow. The Germans ordered the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies to break off their siege of Leningrad and support Army Group Center in its attack on Moscow. Soviet troops, many of whom had friends and family in Leningrad, were not willing to let the Germans get their way. There are countless stories of bravery in fighting the Nazis during this time of the war. One of these heroes of the Soviet Union was Emir Lumanov, a Crimean senior lieutenant in the Red Army. Since he spoke German, he was sent on a mission on the 20th of July, 1941, where he dressed up in a Nazi military uniform pretending to be a Nazi commanding officer checking on a unit. All the members of the unit lay their weapons aside in order to present their identifying papers to Lumanov, only for him to then take the entire company as prisoners of war. As his mission consisted in hindering the advance of the German army, and there were no high-ranking officers that could provide him with valuable information, he chose to have a squad of Soviet soldiers execute the prisoners by shooting them against a brick wall. Soon after, the Germans lay siege to Leningrad, and Lumanov was appointed as leader of a battalion that took part in the Yelnya offensive. The battles for Yelnya in August 1941 were extremely intense. On the 11th of August, he received orders to lead his battalion in advancing further into Yelnya to expel Nazi forces from the western slopes in the area. In just one day of battle, his battalion killed 200 Nazis. After receiving orders to advance further east, they went on to capture 2 tanks and 4 anti-tank guns from the Nazis. By 31st August, his battalion was running very low on ammunition and ran out of food. Yet he continued to lead them in battle, at which point they were fighting off numerically superior forces. In 4 days, they managed to break out of the encirclement, but Lumanov died in the heat of battle on 5th September 1941. He had taken several German lives in the process. The suffering of those in Leningrad is hard to comprehend. Over 1 million had perished by the beginning of spring 1942. By July, over 1 million tons of supplies had been shipped across Lake Ladoga, which had recently melted, to the city, while more than 500,000 civilians had been evacuated and 310,000 troops brought in, along with large numbers of guns and ammunition. In a striking act of defiance, it was these guns, along with those of the Soviet Baltic Fleet, that were able to silence German artillery early in August to allow a concert to be held in Leningrad. This impressive achievement was the first performance in the city of Dmitri Shostakovich's newly composed 7th Symphony, named after the city of Leningrad. To all those who braved going out to hear this incredible concert, the Leningrad Philharmonic played in perfect unison with the Russian guns. Miraculously, not a single German shell fell nearby. The event, broadcast around the world, was a stunning propaganda victory that struck a vital chord for Soviet patriotism. However, the siege of Leningrad would still go on for another year. In total, the German siege of Leningrad lasted for 2 years, 4 months, and 3 weeks. The German army suffered almost 600,000 casualties, while the Red Army reported 3 million casualties, of which 500,000 were killed in action. The loss of civilian lives amounted to more than 1 million, many of which were massacred during the evacuation procedures. During those 2 years, the city became a bloodbath. By January 1944, the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts had amassed just under 1 million men and nearly 22,000 guns, while lying offshore was the Baltic Fleet. The Red Army attack began on 14th January and soon pushed the Germans back. The last German shell to land on Leningrad fell on 23rd January, and 4 days later, at 8 o'clock in the evening, the sky over the city lit up with a mass of color as more than 300 guns fired a salute of triumph. After 880 days, the terrible siege of Leningrad was finally over. An unexpected enemy, women in the Red Army. During the campaign, the Germans were profoundly surprised to learn that the Red Army had recruited so many women to fight alongside men. Indeed, this was an anomaly in any army of the time, and even today. For some German soldiers and officers, to know that they were fighting against women was a disgusting thought, but for others, it enticed their most basic fantasies. The Soviet Union was a pioneering nation in terms of gender equality. Perhaps the best example of this was the creation of an all-female night bomber regiment known as the 588th Regiment between 1942 and 1943, and the 46th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, from there to the end of World War II. The Germans had a nickname for this terrifying group of women pilots, the Night Witches. The regiment came to be when Major Marina Raskova used her position and personal contacts with the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to obtain permission to form female combat units. Combat facilitated and ushered in a reluctant acceptance of women in military, based more upon practicality and necessity than for equality. On October 8, 1941, an order was issued to deploy 3 Women's Air Force units, including the 588th Regiment. The regiment, formed by Raskova and led by Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, was composed primarily of female volunteers in their late teens and early 20s. The women at the 588th Regiment quickly became known for their daring exploits. An attack technique of the night bombers involved idling the engine near the target and gliding to the bomb release point with only wind noise left to reveal their presence. German soldiers thought the approaching idling planes sounded like broomsticks, and hence named the pilots Night Witches. Due to the weight of the bombs and the low altitude of flight, the pilots did not carry parachutes until 1944, so the earlier missions were incredibly risky. Collectively, the Night Witches flew over 23,000 sorties and dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on enemy forces. It is calculated that more than 800,000 Soviet women served in the Red Army during World War II. Female soldiers who were directly involved in combat achieved particular international renown. Not only the Night Witches were admired by the population, but female snipers like Lyudmila Pavlichenko and Rosa Shanina are among the most extraordinary examples of female participation in the war. Between 1941 and 1945, a total of 2,484 Soviet female snipers were deployed for the war, and their combined tally of kills is estimated to be at least 11,280. At first, when Germany attacked the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, thousands of women presented themselves in Red Army offices to volunteer, but most of them were turned away as they had no experience in the battlefield and were deemed unfit for battle. However, after massive losses in the face of Operation Barbarossa, attitudes had to be changed, ensuring a greater role for women who wanted to fight. The High Command of the Red Army allowed for women to be drafted, and they were incorporated in great numbers to medical and auxiliary units, but also to fighting battalions. However, more than half of these women worked in the medical service of the Soviet armed forces. They accounted for 41% of the frontline doctors and 100% of the nursing staff. Those near the front performed their duties under especially difficult conditions and in constant mortal danger. Military medical personnel were second only to the infantry in terms of the number of combat losses. For this reason, thousands of women were awarded the status of Hero of the Soviet Union, being praised and loved in their communities once the war was over. But for others, it was a completely different story. Around 6 million Soviet women died in the course of the war, around 2.5 million of which were involved in the partisan war against the occupying Nazis. Most of the time, the Nazis did not get to see the faces of their female executioners. Women in the Red Army excelled in sniper marksmanship. This not only meant having excellent aim, but also remaining undetected for long periods of time. Over 2,000 women were trained as sharpshooters and deployed to some of the most dangerous battlegrounds, far from their companies and required to lie still for hours to avoid detection and await the perfect shot. Former kindergarten teacher Tanya Baramzina notched 16 kills on the Belarusian front before parachuting behind enemy lines, where she killed another 20 before. When she was cornered in a dugout while tending to some wounded comrades, She defended the position for as long as she could, despite being heavily outnumbered. When the first 3 German soldiers ran up to the dugout, she opened fire with a machine gun, killing them. When more attackers approached, she opened additional fire, determined to fight until her last breath or until she ran out of ammunition. This was exactly what happened, and the brave soldier finally found herself with no more weapons to use. After running out of grenades to throw at her attackers, she was left defenseless as 2 German soldiers entered the dugout from behind and threw their grenades down, injuring her before entering. The Germans dragged her out by her hair before brutally torturing her. With endless cruelty, the soldiers stabbed Baramzina and mutilated her with bayonets, while she loudly swore that they would pay for their crimes. She was brutally beaten with the butts of German rifles until she was barely alive. It was at this moment that one of the Germans had the idea of shooting her in the head with an anti-tank rifle, intended to pierce several inches of steel. She was killed at point blank, and her head and body were practically unrecognizable when the rest of her battalion found her the next morning. Partisan bravery and anti-Nazi resistance. For the Soviet Union, the German invasion was known as the Great Patriotic War. Appealing to traditional Russian concepts of patriotism had been an effective ploy by Stalin, but the men and women of the Red Army were also made to keep fighting by extraordinary levels of brutality. Behind the advancing armies were special troops who swept into newly retaken areas and arrested anyone suspected of collaborating with the Germans in any way whatsoever. These troops also dealt with deserters or those who made any other kind of infringement. One new lieutenant was executed at Stalingrad because several of his men had deserted before he had even arrived at his post. But while the soldiers themselves sometimes needed a good deal of encouraging in order to move forward, the civilian population showed an astounding degree of organization and bravery. As soon as the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, the people in most cities and towns organized themselves to fight the invaders. When the Soviet higher-ups learned of this movement of self-organized patriots, they made arrangements to support them and help them engage in guerrilla-style operations. On June 29, 1941, the government issued its first instructions to local state and party organs to establish partisan units in every enemy-occupied district to create, as Stalin claimed, unbearable conditions for the enemy. Large numbers of Soviet civilians and former soldiers who had fled the German advances or somehow escaped their clutches had, by the spring of 1943, become particularly vicious and increasingly effective bands of outlaws or partisans, sometimes organized from within the Soviet Union by the Soviet intelligence service, but not always. These partisans were blowing up railway lines and roads, attacking convoys and ambushing any troops they could, while also passing back vital intelligence. In effect, the partisans had become a fourth armed service and made the already difficult task of supply even harder for the Germans. Some of them joined the destruction battalions, tasked with complying with Stalin's scorched earth policy. While disorganized and of little efficiency at first, in the spring of 1942, the partisan movement in the Soviet Union gained incredible strength. According to historians, there are 4 main factors that explain the growth of the partisan movement in this period. The first one was the influence of the Red Army's successful counter-offensive at the gates of Moscow. This gave hope to pro-Soviet and anti-German citizens that the enemy, which seemed invincible before, could be defeated. For this reason, fighting would not mean throwing away their lives in a lost cause. Second, the consequences of Nazi Germany's draconian, even murderous occupation policies, ranging from exploitative food and labor procurements to the brutal treatment of prisoners of war, and even the extermination of entire parts of the population. Millions of Russian and Ukrainian citizens had been exposed to the cruelty of the Germans, who assaulted their daughters, killed their sons and brothers, and tossed the bodies into common graves. Some segments of the population, which until that moment had taken a cautious approach, were now decided to fight the occupiers with all their strength. Third, during the ongoing military crisis, the Soviet leadership realized that they needed to actively support the partisans, especially with the establishment of a centralized command structure. This led to the creation of the Central Staff of the partisan movement, headed by Belarusian Communist Party head Panteleimon Ponomarenko. The Central Staff provided leadership, organizational coherence and structure, and important logistical and training support. The fourth factor was the infusion of Red Army dropouts and escaped prisoners of war into the partisan ranks, giving the detachments a much-needed boost of manpower and military skill. Women contributed in large numbers to the Soviet partisan movement, mainly because they saw it as an opportunity to finally fight for their country after the recruitment offices of the Red Army usually turned them down. In fact, many women were among the most famous and heroic partisans, especially very young ones. In October 1941, an 18-year-old high school student from Moscow named Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya volunteered for a partisan unit. Together with other partisans, Kosmodemyanskaya marched southwest toward Narofominsk, crossing the front line into territory occupied by the Germans. They mined roads and cut communication lines. On November 27, 1941, Kosmodemyanskaya received an assignment to burn the village of Petrishchevo, where a German cavalry regiment was stationed. Together with fellow partisans Boris Krynov and Vasily Klubkov, she set fire to 3 houses in the village, but this was not enough, and she was caught alone trying to burn a 4th house. After being arrested, Kosmodemyanskaya was stripped, beaten, interrogated, and savagely tortured with 200 lashes. Her body was also burnt in several places, but she refused to give any information. The following morning, she was marched to the center of the village with a board around her neck bearing the inscription "House Burner." At the central square, she was hanged and left for everyone to see. Kosmodemyanskaya was the first woman to become hero of the Soviet Union during the war, in February 16, 1942. Young as she might have been, Kosmodemyanskaya was not the youngest woman to become a hero of the Soviet Union. This honor belongs to another brave resistance fighter, Zinaida Portnova. In 1942, at the age of 16, Portnova joined the Belarusian resistance movement, becoming a member of the local underground organization named Young Avengers. She began by distributing Soviet propaganda leaflets in German-occupied Belarus, collecting and hiding weapons for Soviet soldiers, and reporting on German troop movements. After learning how to use weapons and explosives from the older members of the group, Portnova participated in sabotage actions at a gas pump, a local power plant, and a brick factory. It was later estimated that these acts may have killed upwards of 100 German soldiers. In 1943, Portnova became employed as a kitchen aide in Obol. In August, she poisoned the food meant for the Nazi garrison stationed there. Immediately falling suspect, she said she was innocent and ate some of the food in front of the Nazis to prove it was not poisoned. After she did not fall ill immediately, they released her. Portnova became sick afterwards, vomiting heavily but eventually recovering from the poison after drinking a large quantity of whey. After she did not return to work, the Germans realized she had been the culprit and started searching for her. It was not until January 1944 that she was finally caught. She was interrogated by a Gestapo officer in the village of Goriani. The officer, convinced that she was only a harmless girl, left his guard down. Portnova took the investigator's pistol off the table, then shot and killed him. When 2 German soldiers entered after hearing the gunshots, she shot them as well. She then attempted to escape the compound and ran into the woods, where she was caught near the banks of a river. After being recaptured, Portnova was tortured. She was later driven into the forest and executed. She was not 18 at the time. In 1958, Portnova was posthumously made a hero of the Soviet Union. There is a monument to her in the city of Minsk, and some youth pioneer movement detachments were named after her. Unspeakable cruelties of the Germans in the Eastern Front. For Hitler and the Nazi leadership, the war in the Soviet Union had never been just about gaining food, oil, and living space. There was also an ideological element, a battle of survival in which German so-called Aryans were fighting inferior Slavs. For the Nazis, it was a racial war. Nowadays, it is believed that this was unfortunate, as it strengthened the union of the Soviet peoples. Not all of them were favorable to Stalin's leadership or to other Soviet communities. For example, during the 1930s, Ukraine had suffered a famine in which millions had died. Many Ukrainians held Stalin directly responsible and even welcomed the Nazi invaders. But although some were absorbed into the Wehrmacht, many more faced barbarities. Villages were burned, people executed, and others rounded up and taken prisoner. Soviet prisoners of war were also treated appallingly compared with Western Allied prisoners of war. Those who did not die of starvation and illness were forced into slave labor. So began a cycle of barely comprehensible violence and cruelty. This also helps explain why Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union in the first place. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact may have been profitable from a strategic standpoint, but it did not change the fact that the Nazis despised the Russians and held incredible contempt for them. Furthermore, the German officials encouraged violence and brutality against the opponent. Based on a selective interpretation of international law, Hitler believed that because the Soviet Union had not signed the Geneva and the Hague Accords, most violent activities that would be considered crimes in other cases did not apply to the Soviets. It was even believed that captured Soviet political officers were not prisoners of war and should be shot out of hand. Another order, directly from the German High Command, specified that, in the event that a German soldier committed offenses against civilians or prisoners, disciplinary action was optional at the discretion of the unit commander. Although some senior German commanders refused to publish these orders and protested them to their superiors, many others simply carried them out. No doubt Nazi ideology, which was pervasive in the Wehrmacht, contributed to this attitude. Like soldiers in many armies, who feel it necessary to dehumanize or demonize their opponents in order to overcome the natural reluctance to kill, many Wehrmacht soldiers regarded the Soviet people as bumbling and potentially treacherous subhumans. The horror of war on the Eastern Front reinforced these attitudes, and quite naturally, atrocities resulted. This unofficial German attitude produced widespread instances of brutality and murder against Soviet prisoners of war and civilians, which in turn served to alienate potential allies, generate widespread resistance, and contribute to the rise of equally brutal partisan resistance. While German genocidal policies towards the Jews, a Europe-wide phenomenon, exacerbated the horrors in the East, it tended to mask the incidents of related German brutality toward the non-Jewish Slavic population, which Hitler also considered as subhumans. Although the sheer numbers of victims defy precise definition, almost 3 million Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians suffered enslavement and, frequently, death or permanent injury in Germany. Another 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war died of starvation, disease, and exposure in German prisoners of war camps, which was around 58% of the total number of captured Red Army soldiers. The German official policies for systematically expropriating food and raw materials often condemned the inhabitants who remained in the occupied territories to slow death. Given these policies, even Soviet collaborators felt little loyalty to the occupiers. Therefore, as we have seen, as the war progressed, the partisan threat rose to catastrophic proportions. In turn, the bitter partisan struggle increased the brutality on both sides. The final 2 years of Germany's war in the East were marked by increasing brutality against the Soviet and Eastern European populations. Yet as crisis followed crisis, the violence extended to any perceived dereliction of duty by members of the Wehrmacht, resulting in tens of thousands being executed. Eventually, once the war reached East Prussia, even German civilians were subject to military rule, and therefore also the army's extreme violence. The brutalization of the army over many years on the Eastern Front and the uncompromising character of National Socialism left no room for sentimentality or pity. As violence dominated the Eastern Front, the human cost of the war increased dramatically, but this was always viewed by the Nazis as necessary and required little justification within the army. Such a conception reflects the absolutist war aims of National Socialism, in which no casualty list was too high in the service of victory or to avoid defeat. By the end of the war, men were sacrificed at such a frightening rate that well over half of all the army's losses in the East, more than 3 million soldiers, were sustained in the final 18 months of the war. Conclusion. The sheer number of casualties from both sides and of civilian deaths in the Eastern Front is almost unimaginable. Tens of millions of lives were lost thanks to the racial hatred instigated by one man. But this hatred proved to be his downfall. Attacking the Soviet Union in the spring of 1941 may have seemed like a good idea, but it would eventually lead to the turnaround of World War II, and Hitler would be ultimately defeated. By May 1941, with France defeated and most of Europe conquered, the Nazis had only one opponent, Britain. 1 year later, the United States had entered the war, and Hitler was fighting a bloody war in 2 fronts, now that the Soviet Union had turned from ally to enemy. Operation Barbarossa is widely regarded as the event that changed the war, but for the people that was involved in it, it meant much more. Some of the goriest and most disgusting bloodbaths in the history of mankind happened during these months in Soviet territory.